Why Race Matters, Chapter 6, Race and Values. I'm going to be reading the majority of the second half of this chapter, but the first half of the chapter I'm pretty much going to skip entirely except for this introductory paragraph. There are some good points made in the beginning of the chapter, but it's a little dry. So once again, if you want to catch yourself up on what I'm leaving out, you're more than welcome to visit the description down below for a link to the entire book. So, race and values. This chapter has two aims: to explain why group differences do not imply that any group is better than any other, and how the norms of different groups can diverge widely without any being deviant or pathological. Chapter 7 has the complementary aim of explaining how, despite the absence of any absolute standpoint, one may still reach normative conclusions about racial disputes. I should emphasize at once that when I deny that intelligence or self-restraint are inherently good, I am not advising the reader to be indifferent to such qualities, nor am I suggesting that I am. My point is the purely logical one that in themselves, race differences are facts of nature without moral significance. Morality as a phenotype. Smudging the line between innate and socially inculcated behavior challenges the ancient conception of norms, or culture, as reason's governor on natural impulses. Plato and Kant, Immanuel Kant, thought pure reason revealed a noumenal realm beyond man's empirical character. Thomas Hobbes, thought that instrumental reason delivered man from his natural state of war. Romantics like Mark Twain invert the relation, opposing the innocence of nature to the corrupt artifices of society. Against all such views, bioenvironmental determinism maintains that socialization expresses genes just as surely as do pre-social drives like sex or hunger. Nurture is nature. An innate tendency to follow a norm can be expected to correlate with an innate tendency to train the young to follow it, and an innate tendency in the young to respond positively to the training. For all these tendencies are apt to be adaptive when any one of them is. Where cooperation, for instance, increases inclusive fitness, so does training one's children to cooperate, and so does the responsiveness of one's children to training in cooperation. Training and its positive uptake enhance the cooperativeness, hence the inclusive fitness of one's offspring. And what enhances one's offspring's inclusive fitness enhances one's own. In an environment favoring cooperation, that genotype is likeliest to spread half copies of itself, which programs cooperation, the training of offspring in cooperation, and offspring who cooperate when trained. Instinctual drives emerge as passive genetic correlates of socialization. Training is no epiphenomenon. It does modify instinctual drives, but it is a collateral effect of the genes that produce the drives it modifies, with the causal relations posited as in Figure 6.2. The idea that morality transcends nature comes of asking what unsocialized humans would be like, a question that assumes that there could be unsocialized humans. The question, how fast could a man run were he 50 feet tall, is ill-defined after all, suspending as it does the very laws needed to answer it. Likewise, the question, what would a world of unsocialized human beings be like, suspends the very evolutionary laws that produced human beings, and govern what human beings would do under hypothetical circumstances. As the development of socializing mechanisms is part of man's nature, according to these very laws, there is nothing unsocialized men would be like. Between group moral divergence. The hypothesis that group norms are evolved reinforcement tendencies predicts that groups developing where divergent reinforcement tendencies are adaptive will develop different moralities, or different levels of concern for morality. A tendency to reinforce honesty, cooperation, and within-group altruism is probably always adaptive to some extent, and so to be found among the norms of every group. But groups developing in different environments may assign different weights to these core tendencies. Imagine hunters in a cold climate exploiting dangerous animals, storing and sharing food, and gatherers in a more forgiving climate. The hunters must cooperate or die, whereas cooperation is less important for the gatherers, each of whom can more nearly support himself and his or her offspring by individual effort. Since each hunter has more to gain from the cooperation of others, there is a greater return in fitness on the efforts of each to get other hunters to cooperate. Hunters can therefore be expected to develop stronger cooperative tendencies, to reinforce cooperation more strongly, and to respond more positively to the reinforcement of cooperation. The gatherer ethos will not be absolutely uncooperative, but it will be less cooperative than the hunters. Hunters will deem a higher level of cooperation morally obligatory, because if you don't cooperate, we're all going to die, basically. And each group will probably disdain the minimum degree of cooperation expected within the other. In other words, you're not going to be very well liked if you're lazy. There may be differences in sexual norms as well. Since it is easier for female gatherers in a warm climate to support their offspring, there will be a less intense selection for females who prefer fidelity in their mates. Hence, by what Darwin called sexual selection, less intense selection for males disposed to conform to this female demand. Hunters may regard gatherer sexual morality as loose, while gatherers regard hunter sexual morality as inhibited. We saw in chapters 3 and 4 that the races differ in a number of empirical characteristics, in great measure, so the evidence suggests, for genetic reasons. Of these, time preferences in particular are continuous with what are ordinarily called values. But the upshot of skeptical naturalism is that this is no basis for ranking groups. We cannot say that the time preferences or values of one race are better than those of another, because such comparisons explain nothing. Similarly, the higher intelligence of whites and Asians no more makes them superior to blacks than a cheetah's greater speed makes it superior to a horse. Such comparisons lack empirical content. Like the cheetah's supple spine and the horse's hoof, the levels of intelligence of the different races were responses to environmental pressures, as were the values embraced by different groups. Known race differences in intelligence, impulsivity, and aggressiveness, and such race differences as there proved to be in cooperativeness and rule following, together with the divergent evolutionary histories of the races, suggest that the races have also evolved divergent evaluations of cooperativeness, aggression, rule following, and concern with the future. We will see further evidence of this in Chapter 7. However, should whites have evolved preferences and modes of thought closer to those conventionally called moral, we must remember that there is no Archimedean point from which to judge moral thinking better than non-moral thinking. So basically, what he means by Archimedean point is you can't point to a place on the map where morality exists or where the source of morality comes from. You can't say it's here or there. It's something that comes from our circumstances, unless you're religious and you think it comes from the Bible. And then you're just completely lost, because the Bible is the most immoral compilation of slop I've ever encountered. 3 corollaries. The theory that group differences in norms reflect evolved adaptations has 3 noteworthy consequences. They may be viewed as testable predictions of the theory, or, if the phenomena in question are granted to be real, as confirmation. Number 1. The response of a group to externally imposed socialization is unlikely to resemble the response to the same socialization of the group in which the socialization evolved. If the pressures that select a socializing regimen also select responses to it, children in groups that evolved the regimen have been shaped to internalize it more readily than children of other groups. Consider the suggestion that making school seem as important to black children as it is made to seem to Asian children will improve black academic performance. This suggestion is often made by circumlocution to avoid implied criticism of black culture as anti-intellectual. Yet, however broached, it assumes that presenting high grades and esteem of teachers in a good light will benefit black children as much as it benefits children of other races. But such representations will make little difference to black performance or attitudes if valuing academic success is a correlate, and not a cause, of educability. So telling black kids, man, having good grades is great, academic achievement is great, that's not going to make them work harder or do better in school if they're inherently, genetically less educable. That's the reality. Low time preferences are necessary both for achieving high grades. I don't know if you saw the video discussing time preferences, but you should go back. I'm not sure which chapter it is or which video, but you should listen to all of them. There's one that discusses marshmallows, the marshmallow experiment. And if you offer a black kid a marshmallow now or 2 tomorrow, black kids are going to take 1 now, and white kids will take 2 tomorrow. That's what time preference basically means, and that's genetic. Low time preferences are necessary both for achieving high grades and for wanting to achieve them. So impulsive individuals will not tolerate the delay necessary to reap the benefits of studying, no matter how enthusiastically they hear studying praised. Should the factors causing Asian parents to extol academic excellence also be the cause of Asian children caring to excel, encouragement to do their schoolwork will bounce off of a higher proportion of black children than Asian. So, white and Asian children have a lower time preference. They are less impulsive by nature, so they're more likely, when encouraged to study because they can put off their impulses for watching TV or playing their video game or whatever. They can understand that it will benefit them in the long run, and they can resist their temptations to slack off, basically. But there are those who would like to believe that it's just a culture thing, and if we just encouraged black children to study more, if we tried to explain to them why it's better, then then they'll start to study. No. Number 2, violence will increase when a group acquires killing technologies it did not evolve. Stable groups that manufacture devices such as firearms must also have evolved the self-restraint not to employ them to maladaptive excess. A group developing the intelligence to invent weapons ahead of sufficiently strong inhibitions against their indiscriminate use will tend to destroy itself. New technologies themselves exert selectional pressure toward ability to control their use. Therefore, a group that acquires a weapon from another group, rather than having developed it, is less likely to have evolved the appropriate inhibitions. Groups that do not discover fermentation have no reason to develop tolerance for alcohol, and when introduced to it, often fall prey to drinking problems. Access to exogenous killing techniques may be expected to yield parallel results. Chicago. There has been a sharp increase in gunshot homicides among black males in the last half-century. In 1943, there were 44 handgun homicides in New York City. In New York City in 1992, 1,500 black males died of gunshot wounds inflicted by other black males. Since 92% of the 2,200 murders in New York that year were committed by blacks, black males must also have killed several hundred other non-blacks with firearms. In 1992, 23,760 murders were committed in the United States, for a murder rate of 9.3 per 100,000. This is far greater than that of France, 4.5 per 100,000, Germany, 3.9, or Austria, 2.3. The involvement of firearms in 70% of these homicides supports the widespread view of the United States as a violent country. But disaggregating homicides by race, following Taylor, 1994, presents a markedly different picture. In 1992, 55% of offenders whose race was known were black, and 43% white. Since blacks are 12.1% of the population, this means that the murder rate for blacks in the United States was 44.9 out of 100,000, while that for whites was 4.78, much closer than 9.3 to the figures characterizing European whites. Let's see, I don't know if it's going to do the math for us later. 44.9, 4.7. So basically 10 times. Blacks had 10 times the murder rate of whites. Detroit is perceived as having become extremely violent in recent decades, its homicide rate among juveniles having grown from 8 in 100,000 to 30 in 100,000 during the 1980s. However, the homicide rate for the white juveniles in Detroit remained constant during this period. The upward trend was due to black-on-black murder, and that increase, quote, could be attributed almost entirely to firearm homicides, end quote. Much of the June 12, 1996 issue of the Journal of the American Medical Association is devoted to firearms and violence. One California study reported that the hospital discharge rate for gunshot wounds for blacks between the ages of 15 and 24 was 439 per 100,000, while those for non-Hispanic whites in that age group was 28 per 100,000. The rates in the 25 to 34 age group were 235 and 17, respectively. Assaults accounted for 74% of all firearm-related crimes. Assault rates for males aged 15 to 24 years were 598 per 100,000 population for blacks versus 27 per 100,000 for whites. 625, 4, 6. So that's almost a 24 times difference, 2,400% more firearm-related assaults for blacks than for whites. How do you explain that? You can explain that with racism and oppression, like an idiot, or you could explain it with genetics, like a smart person. Gary Kleck, 1991, has found that even controlling for gun availability, black males between the ages of 15 and 24 have almost 10 times as many fatal gun accidents as whites of that age. The ratio falls to 5 to 1 for the 25 to 39 age group. Most of these accidents involve display of weapons, mock fighting, or mock threats. Kleck speculates that, quote, accidental and intentional killers may share some underlying personality traits, such as poor aggression control, impulsiveness, willingness to take risks, and sensation seeking, end quote. These are traits which distinguish blacks from whites. See chapters 3 and 4. The race difference in gunshot homicides is largely due, I suggest, to the failure of blacks to evolve inhibitions adapted to firearms like those evolved by whites and Asians during their long march to the discovery of explosives. The black gunshot homicide rate is not explained by the sheer accessibility of guns, since guns have been available to whites and Asians, who invented and now manufacture them, for centuries. Every Swiss male citizen owns a gun, yet the annual adult homicide rate in Switzerland is 3.2 per 100,000. Guns have become more available to whites as well as blacks in recent decades, but the acceleration of the black homicide rate far exceeds the white. Apparently, the race gap in gunshot homicides is due to an increased availability of guns to blacks. In many cities, a large proportion of young black males, far higher than the proportion of young white males, carry firearms. Blacks are evidently more drawn to guns and readier to use them, especially in disputes whites would find trivial. There's a footnote here, number 33. 16-year-old Brian White emptied the magazine of an automatic pistol into 12-year-old Quentin Carter because White had felt dissed by the manner in which Carter had asked him for a quarter. End of footnote. Possibly thresholds of aggressive reaction and levels of empathy that work for African weapons are too low to regulate more efficient European weapons. Death is relatively unlikely when sudden anger must be vented through a spear or one's fists, which are hard to wield and easy to fend off or flee. Death is far more likely with guns at hand. Number 3. Remember, these numbers are noteworthy consequences of the theory that group differences in norms reflect evolved adaptations. All right, so number 3. Divergent evolution can scramble moral signals. In any cooperative group, an inclusively adaptive response to another's injury is sympathy, aid, a desire to suppress the cause of injury, and, when the cause of injury is perceived to be oneself, feelings of guilt. To select these responses, evolution must find a way for organisms to signal such subjective accompaniments of injury as anguish, a problem it solves by associating subjective states with spontaneous outward expressions. Human beings raise their voices when angry, smile when pleased. These natural signs also tend to elicit responses, as a shout of anger will often cause others to attempt calming measures. We may call shouting a natural indicator of anger and a natural elicitor of efforts to calm. In the case of aversive subjective states, the feedback between utterance and response is generally negative, as the response diminishes the signal by soothing the injury. I conjecture that given levels of anger signal a less serious injury among blacks than whites, and that a positive feedback between black expressions of anger and white efforts to assuage it explains some otherwise puzzling aspects of race relations. White guilt and black intransigence, stubbornness basically, may in part be effects of white misinterpretation of black reactivity and an overall mismatch between black emotional cues and white responses. That this sort of misunderstanding regularly takes place can hardly be denied. According to Kochman, quote, whites invariably interpret black anger and verbal aggressiveness as more provocative and threatening than do blacks, end quote. A natural hypothesis is that white expectations about anger have been shaped by dealings with other whites, and that a show of belligerence, which, among whites, is normally caused by injury and predicts retaliation, is, among blacks, often caused by what to whites are trifles. More precisely, any given level of anger is apt to signal more serious injury when reached by a white than when reached by a black. Not having evolved to interpret black displays, whites tend to interpret black anger, including anger directed at them, as indicating the more serious injury such anger would signal from whites. As guilt and concern are evolved white responses to perceived injury, whites tend to blame themselves for black rage and seek to ameliorate it. Again, this seems confirmed in experience. Quote, whites wonder what horrendous offense the other person could have committed to deserve such an emotionally powerful response. End quote. However, as white reactions are geared to injuries that cause anger in whites, they do not address the causes of black anger. The reduction in display that usually follows a placatory response does not ensue, leaving whites feel like they have left something undone. A further stage in this dynamic is black perception of solicitous white responses as rewards, which reinforces black anger. Quote, it seems plausible that the emotion of guilt has been selected for in humans partly in order to motivate the cheater to compensate his misdeeds and to behave reciprocally. End quote. At the same time, the existence of guilt may select for, quote, sham moralistic aggression when no real cheating appears to induce reparative altruism, and a feeling of genuine moralistic aggression even when one has not been wronged, if so doing leads another to reparative altruism. End quote. If that didn't make sense to you, basically people will pretend to be offended or pretend to be hurt to get the other person to feel guilty and then give them stuff. Even if it's just validation. It might not be material gains, but it could just be, oh, I'm so sorry. Yeah, you should be sorry. Oh, I am. Please don't call me a racist. Yeah, you better be sorry, honky. The races may have not interacted long enough for blacks to have evolved race-specific sham moralistic aggression, but white guilt may elicit a generalized readiness to display it. Consider by analogy how evolution has shaped infants to cry to express needs, and adults to respond to infant crying by meeting those needs. This is the perfect analogy. Let's continue. Crying gets babies fed. But nature has made the mediating emotions less than entirely pleasant. A baby's crying provokes irritation as well as concern, and often parents exert themselves just to get some peace. Now imagine a hypercolicky baby whose signals are non-standard. Cries that normally express hunger do not express hunger for him, so attempts at feeding do not quiet him. The least amount of wetness may produce a diaper rash type of crying that is not calmed by a change of diaper. 24 hours of dealing with such a baby would leave the typical adult unstrung. I am proposing that black anger, white failure to read it, and the consequent failure of white solicitude to reduce it leaves whites unstrung. Blacks complain, and whites do their best to fix the problem. And then they find something else to complain about, and we try to fix the problem. And they find something else to complain about, and we try to fix the problem. But it will never be fixed because what they really want is equality. Well, they call it equity, but they want to be equal, and they're not. They want equal outcomes, but they don't have equal hardware operating that would lead to equal outcomes. So it's just not going to happen. The only way is to steal from white people and give to black people. That's the only way to theoretically shut them up, but it won't work. It will never work. It will never be enough. This is becoming glaringly evident. One point favoring the crossed signals hypothesis is its agreement with everyday observation. As Kochman confirms, the black communicative style is more confrontational. Black loudness is a stereotype, and eavesdroppers will be struck by the manner in which black conversation may suddenly jump to a level of intensity that among whites would prefigure a fight and as quickly subside. Such conversations probably agitate white listeners more than the black participants. A second point in favor of it is that the usual explanation of white guilt, namely unblinking recognition of white misdeeds, is inadequate. Like I was saying, it's never enough. Most whites know that no living white has any direct connection with slavery, and few remain who were associated with Jim Crow laws. Only 20% of antebellum Southern families owned slaves, so few living Southern whites are likely to be connected to slavery even by descent. Blacks today enjoy civil rights, legal privileges under affirmative action, and full access to a system of public schools supported primarily by whites. Black-on-white homicides, which are relatively common, are seldom publicized, while white attacks on blacks are treated as national scandals. Many of the whites who are most solicitous of black feelings have done nothing personal to atone for. Actual mistreatment of blacks, then, seems insufficient for white guilt. Consider, in the light of this hypothesis, a number of incidents that have received media coverage in the United States in the past few years. I think I will go through this list of incidents, which is quite interesting, in the next video.